It was a calm Monday morning when Mark Dalton, a man in his mid-40s, boarded his own airline's flight, Sky Express 707. Mark owned Dalton Airlines, though few people knew his face. He preferred it that way, choosing to stay low-key about his success. Mark looked like any other traveler. He enjoyed observing people without them knowing who he was, and he especially liked checking in on his airline from the customer's perspective. He settled into his seat in the first-class section, hoping for a quiet flight to New York. As passengers were still finding their seats, he noticed a young lady a few rows in front. She looked nervous, repeatedly adjusting her bag and casting hurried glances around. Mark thought she might be a first-time flyer or perhaps had a fear of flying. He smiled to himself, remembering when he used to be that nervous too. Meanwhile, a tall, stern-looking flight attendant named Cindy Cameron was making her way down the aisle, distributing menus and greeting passengers. Cindy had worked for Dalton Airlines for about 3 years, but she had a habit of looking down on anyone she thought didn't belong in first class. The passengers who didn't wear designer clothes or carry flashy luggage always seemed to get her narrow-eyed, judging stare. She was quick to assume things about people, and Mark could see her casting glances at some of the less polished passengers with a look that could only be described as annoyed. Mark noticed her as she approached him. Cindy handed him a menu, her expression blank, her gaze barely meeting his eyes. "Here's the menu," she said without a smile, moving swiftly to the next passenger, a businessman with an expensive watch who got a wide smile and a polite nod from Cindy. Mark observed this interaction silently, storing the incident in his mind without saying a word. He felt disappointment but decided to let it pass. A few minutes later, as the flight reached cruising altitude, Cindy began serving drinks. She returned to Mark's row, holding a tray with steaming coffee and other refreshments. Mark politely requested a cup of coffee. "What would you like?" she asked, barely glancing at him. "Just coffee, please," he replied. Cindy rolled her eyes slightly, seemingly annoyed with his simple request. She turned around, pouring the coffee with a touch of impatience. As she handed it over to Mark, a momentary smirk crossed her face, and then, suddenly, without warning, she tilted the cup sharply forward. Hot coffee splashed onto Mark's face, causing him to flinch in pain. "Oh! I'm so sorry," Cindy said quickly, though her expression didn't look too apologetic. "Clumsy me, I must have tripped on something." She didn't offer any help to clean him up. Instead, she moved on as though nothing had happened. Mark's face was red from the coffee burn, but he calmly took a napkin and began wiping himself. The lady across from him, who had noticed the whole incident, offered him a tissue with a sympathetic look. "That was very uncalled for," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "I've never seen such behavior from a flight attendant." Mark thanked her and simply nodded, still maintaining his composure. Deep down, he knew he'd have to address this behavior, but he preferred to wait and see if Cindy would show any sign of remorse or professionalism. However, throughout the flight, Cindy continued treating Mark as though he didn't belong. When she passed by him, she didn't offer any additional assistance or an apology. She seemed almost pleased with herself, thinking she'd given the ordinary-looking man a piece of her mind. What Cindy didn't realize was that her actions were not going unnoticed. Other passengers had seen what happened and were quietly murmuring among themselves. Mark overheard a few of their comments, mostly shocked whispers about her lack of courtesy and respect. He continued to remain silent, choosing to handle the situation differently. As the plane continued its journey, Cindy's attitude didn't change, and her disdain for Mark seemed to grow. She gave preferential treatment to other first-class passengers while ignoring Mark, as if she'd labeled him as someone not worth her time. But little did she know, this was only the beginning of a surprising journey she would never forget. The rest of the flight to New York continued without much incident, though Cindy kept giving Mark dismissive glances every now and then. Mark noticed her coldness toward other passengers who didn't look like they fit the typical first-class image in her eyes. He was careful not to make a scene. He preferred letting people show their true colors, even if it meant a bit of discomfort on his part. As they began their descent, Cindy finally made an announcement for the passengers to prepare for landing. Mark straightened up, collecting his thoughts. He hadn't planned on making any big moves today, but after what he'd experienced and observed, he knew this couldn't just end here. The airline he had worked so hard to build didn't stand for this type of behavior, and he couldn't allow it to continue. When the plane landed, Mark patiently waited for the aisle to clear before he made his way out. Cindy stood near the exit, saying polite goodbyes to each passenger, at least to those she deemed worthy of her attention. When Mark reached the door, she barely looked at him, giving him a curt nod. "Goodbye," she said flatly, her eyes already shifting to the next passenger. Mark smiled and replied warmly, "Goodbye, Cindy. You may be hearing from me sooner than you think." Cindy blinked, confused for a moment, but quickly shrugged it off. She had no idea who he was, and she didn't think twice about his words. Once inside the airport terminal, Mark called his assistant, Rachel, a reliable and sharp-minded woman who had worked closely with him for years. She was someone he trusted fully to handle important matters, especially when it came to the well-being of their employees and customers. "Rachel," he said, keeping his tone steady, "could you arrange a meeting with the head of human resources and the flight supervisor at our New York office? I'd like to address an incident from today's flight." Rachel responded immediately, "Of course, Mr. Dalton. Should I prepare any specific details for the meeting?" Mark paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, please note that I'll need a full review of the service records for an employee named Cindy Cameron. I think it's time we have a thorough discussion on customer treatment and professionalism." Rachel took down the notes without a hint of surprise. She knew how seriously Mark took the culture and standards of his airline. She arranged the meeting for the following day, giving Mark enough time to gather his thoughts and prepare any necessary details. The next morning, as Mark arrived at Dalton Airlines' New York headquarters, Rachel greeted him with a stack of reports, including employee feedback records and customer complaints. To his dismay, Cindy Cameron's file revealed a troubling pattern. There were multiple customer complaints about her attitude, many echoing the same issues he had experienced firsthand. Her record showed warnings and even a few disciplinary notes, but she had somehow managed to stay in her position. At 10 a.m., the HR manager, Tom Reeves, and the head of customer service, Lydia Coleman, joined Mark in the conference room. Both Tom and Lydia were experienced in their roles, and they took employee issues seriously. After brief introductions, Mark shared what had happened on his flight, providing a detailed account of Cindy's behavior and how it affected not just him, but other passengers as well. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton, for bringing this to our attention," Tom said seriously. "It's disappointing to hear that Cindy's behavior has remained unchecked, despite the warnings." Lydia nodded, adding, "We pride ourselves on customer service, and it's our duty to address this properly. We'll arrange a meeting with Cindy to discuss the matter." Mark shook his head, holding up a hand. "No need for just a discussion. I'd like to be present when you speak with her. This goes beyond a simple conversation. This is about preserving the values of our airline." Both Tom and Lydia agreed, though they looked surprised. They'd never seen Mark so involved in an employee matter before. But they knew he was serious, and they respected his decision to handle it personally. A few hours later, Cindy was called into the office, completely unaware of the meeting's true purpose. As she entered the room, she looked slightly nervous, glancing at the unfamiliar faces around her. When she saw Mark seated at the table, she froze, recognizing him as the same ordinary-looking passenger she'd poured coffee on the day before. Mark kept his expression calm, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze. Cindy's face turned pale as realization set in, and her hands began to tremble. She had no idea he was the owner of Dalton Airlines. "Please have a seat, Cindy," Mark said in a calm voice, gesturing to the chair across from him. Cindy reluctantly sat down, visibly shaken. She tried to speak, stammering out an apology. "Mr. Dalton, I didn't know who you were. I'm so sorry if I—" Mark raised a hand, silencing her gently. "Cindy, let's set aside titles and faces for a moment. I didn't expect any special treatment. But what I do expect is respect, decency, and courtesy for every passenger on my airline. It's not about who I am. It's about how you treat people, regardless of what you think they look like or who you think they might be." Cindy looked down, her face a mix of embarrassment and fear. "We've reviewed your service record," Lydia added, her tone firm but professional. "This incident isn't an isolated one. The company has given you several chances to improve, but it appears the behavior hasn't changed." Mark leaned forward, his voice softer but unwavering. "Cindy, we value every employee and we provide support to help them grow. But we also can't let poor treatment continue unchecked. This isn't personal. It's about doing what's right for the people who choose to fly with us." The silence that followed felt heavy as Cindy processed his words. She knew what was coming, but there was little she could say to change the outcome. Cindy sat in silence, her head lowered as the weight of the situation settled in. She knew her actions had consequences, but facing them here, in front of the owner himself, was a level of accountability she hadn't expected. After a brief pause, Mark spoke, his tone calm yet final. "Cindy, I believe in second chances, but in your case, there have been many chances already. The disrespect you showed yesterday wasn't just directed at me, but at our values and the experience we promise every passenger. Unfortunately, I don't think you can continue with us at Dalton Airlines." Cindy's eyes widened, but she didn't protest. She knew deep down this was inevitable. Mark's decision was clear and firm, with a sense of justice that she couldn't argue against. Lydia and Tom stood quietly by, knowing the decision had been well considered and was in line with the company's standards. Mark nodded to Lydia, who handed Cindy her final documents. "We'll provide a severance package to help you transition, but today will be your last day with us," Lydia explained gently. Cindy accepted the papers with a shaky hand, her voice barely a whisper as she muttered, "Thank you, Mr. Dalton." I'm sorry." Mark offered a slight nod. "I hope this experience serves as a lesson. Respect and kindness cost nothing, Cindy. I wish you well." With that, Cindy stood up, gave one last uncertain look around the room, and exited quietly, leaving behind her career at Dalton Airlines. As the door closed, Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. He turned to Tom and Lydia. "Thank you both. It's never easy, but I know it was the right call for our team and our customers." They nodded in agreement, each of them feeling a renewed sense of purpose to uphold the standards that made Dalton Airlines a place of integrity and respect. As Mark left the building, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had taken a stand not just for himself, but for every customer who deserved fair and respectful treatment, regardless of who they were. And this brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories. Have a nice day.